because I don't trust the cloud. Okay. So we are recording right now, but we are not yet live. We are. Okay, it's going to start in a moment.
That looks fine, Karen.
Good.
Really good.
Thank you.
So what is now going on? I think we are live. Okay. I'm not sure if we are live or not. It's a little, if we could check that, that would be great. Not sure.
We just started mowing the lawn outside my door.
I'm trying to, technically, it should be. Okay, so it tells me that we are not live. Let me see. Tracy Ann. Let me see what I need to do then. Is this thing?
Are we going live right now? I need to plug in headphones because they're mowing the lawn right outside my door.
Oh, we don't hear it. Oh, there's a ding. Did you hear that?
I did.
So, okay. Okay, so let me see what I need to do because it tells me we are live, but we are not.
Okay. Yes, because it does say.
Start recording. Hello. And we are going to go live. It's working on processing. Okay, I think we are live. Welcome everyone. Welcome to the video panel discussion, Hope, Justice, and the Pandemic, a Theological Conversation. The four panelists you see are all professors at Perkins School of Theology at SMU and good friends, intellectual friends, and just plain old friends. Our dialogue on the current pandemic will be informed by each participant's academic expertise as well as clergy experience. So I will start by introducing our panelists in alphabetical order with me last. First, then, Dr. Karen Baker-Fletcher, Professor of Systematic Theology at Perkins School of Theology at SMU. Her PhD is from Harvard University, and she is a specialist in womanist and feminist theology and theory. Her research spans a rich spectrum of interests, such as concepts of God and divine love, process theism and ecology, as well as relational theologies, particularly women and theology, contemporary and historical African-American religious thought and global theologies, 19th century holiness women and Wesley's concepts of divine grace and perfect love, as well as intercultural constructive theology and religion and literature and culture. A wonderful set of interests. Among her publications, I would like to mention that she is most well known for the book Dancing with God, a womanist perspective on the Trinity. Something here that makes too much noise. And I will turn this. So Professor Baker-Fletcher is most well known for her book Dancing with God, a womanist perspective on the Trinity. She is also the author of Sisters of Dust, Sisters of Spirit, Womanist Wordings on God and Creation. She is the co-author of My Sister, My Brother, Womanist and Exodus God Talk. And she has also authored a Singing Something, Womanist Reflections on Anna Julia Cooper. She has been listed as one of the 15 top religious leaders on ecological issues by the Grist magazine. She is the member of the prestigious work group on constructive theology and a member of the Society for the Study of Black Religion. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Tamara Lewis, who is an assistant professor of the History of Christianity here at Perkins School of Theology. Her PhD is from Vanderbilt University. And her research examines the ways Protestant doctrine was used in the development of racial ideologies in early modern England. This involves tracing how theological beliefs were applied to and shaped emerging discourses and practices regarding skin color differences back in the late 19th and 17th century and onward. Now, she also analyzes early modern perspectives about theological anthropology and somatic difference in relation to England's burgeoning participation in the transatlantic human trade, slavery, and colonialism. Now, in addition to articles and chapters on these topics, Professor Lewis is completing a fascinating book foregrounding these themes. I can't wait to read it. She's also working on a monograph on the history of Methodism and race. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Alice Mckenzie, who is the LeVan Professor of Preaching and Worship here at Perkins School of Theology, and the Altschuler Distinguished Teaching Professor, which is the highest teaching honor here at SMU. Furthermore, she is the director of the Center for Preaching Excellence at SMU, which is a center dedicated to fostering transformative preaching, both in local congregations and among people elsewhere. And Professor Mckenzie has been leading a number of events through this center across the country and more recently via Zoom. Her PhD is from Princeton Theological Seminary. And I would like to add that she, in her own words, is committed to helping students find and use their own voices in the pulpit as they gain competence, confidence, and courage. And she's also committed to helping preachers honor their prophetic voices while nurturing pastoring relationships. Beautiful words. I'm excited that I have such a colleague. Now, together with Professor Wes Allen, also from Perkins, Professor Mckenzie has launched a series of brief interviews sponsored by the Perkins Center for Preaching Excellence, a series titled, "What's a Preacher to Do? Preaching in a Double Pandemic of COVID and Racism." Dr. Mckenzie and Dr. Allen also offer a webinar for clergy titled "Preaching in a Pandemic of Racism, Crafting Sermons that Offer Both Hope and Challenge." She is the author of 10 books, nothing less, and numerous articles. I'll mention a few. Her books span 2 clusters of topics. One covering her research interests in the wisdom literature of the Bible. So she has published Preaching Proverbs, Wisdom for the Pulpit, the Gospel of Matthew, Preaching Biblical Wisdom in a Self-Help Society, Hear and Be Wise, Becoming a Teacher and Preacher of Wisdom. And more recently, her focus is on a separate cluster of topics having to do with the role of imagination in preaching and on what preachers can learn from novelists and screenwriters. So she wrote Novel Preaching, Tips from Top Writers on Crafting Creative Sermons, beautiful title for a great book, and Making a Scene in the Pulpit, Vivid Preaching for Visual Listeners. She received the SMU Ford Fellowship Award for this book. And now I'll say a few things about myself. My name is Natalia Maranduk. I'm an assistant professor of systematic theology here at Perkins School of Theology at SMU. My PhD is from Yale University. And my research interests are at the intersection between feminist theology and gender theory. I do systematic and constructive theology, and I like to work with the dialogue between theology and science, particularly neuroscience. I'm interested in the role of women in the shaping of religion more broadly, the phenomenon of human migration, theologies of reconciliation, and the triadic cluster of theological anthropology, soteriology, and Christology. I have written a number of articles and chapters with a constructive feminist approach to systematic theology, and I published my first book, The Goodness of Home, Human and Divine Love and the Making of the Self, which was the winner of the Aldersgate Prize. And I'm currently completing my second monograph, provisionally titled Love and Human Thriving, a Feminist Soteriology. I'm delighted to co-chair the AAR's Christian Systematic Theology Unit, and I'm excited especially to be a participant in a Templeton Award for my work on science-engaged theology. So with that said, I would like now to move on to our conversation. I will moderate this conversation somewhat. And so I'm going to start by posing a question to my colleagues. Starting with the phenomenon in which we live, the pandemic. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has been plaguing us, literally, for a few months, although it seems to be for a much longer time. And it seems that we are far from its conclusion, even though there is, of course, more information about the nature of this disease and the virus that causes it. Now, vaccines are not yet available, and so far, treatment for this illness remains rather uncertain. As of today, I checked earlier this morning, there have been over 5.5 million cases and over 172,000 deaths in the US alone. Last time I looked up these numbers was 2 days ago. There are over 300,000 more cases and nearly 7,000 more deaths since 2 days ago alone. These numbers are likely to rise much higher in the next weeks and months in the fall, clearly. That said, given the duration of this pandemic crisis, a lot of public spaces, businesses, institutions, and schools, such as our university, have been or are in the process of reopening, even as some had to shut down due to the explosive spread of the virus. But many are opening up, citing the need to attend to economic concerns, among other concerns, certainly. But the economic concerns seem to have quite a bit of weight. Now, I want to add another thing here to frame the conversation. To be sure, our society is facing a cluster of crises. Yet the economic and the health dimension of this conglomerate of crises and issues are often presented by a number of voices as a zero-sum game, either or, the more one, the less the other, and vice versa. So we either foreground human health or we care about the economy, say such voices. I would like to argue that this is a false dichotomy. Many have argued already this way. I would like to join my voice to the chorus to propose that this is not a zero-sum game, but rather, I think it's the case that when human beings flourish, the economy which they inhabit and to which they contribute is also thriving. Now, to leave that in a brief form, here's the question. Considering that health and the economic sphere are just two out of many facets of a complicated set of crises that we are facing as a society, as a human community, as a church, broadly speaking, and community of believers and of different kinds, what deeper principles, theological, moral, philosophical, pastoral, perhaps other kind, what deeper principles or what kind of framework do you think ought to guide our thinking and practical decision-making to address these crises? How does your own expertise in your specific academic field might inform the kind of framework from within which you want to think about this? At least I don't know.
Who would you like to begin? Shall I begin?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, as you were speaking and reading that out loud, and it's always wonderful to hear it said in your own voice. And you asked us to look deeper. One of the things that I heard as you were speaking was an intersectional analysis, which means that we are able to look at problems that are interconnected with one another, rather than isolate the human health issue over here, and then the ability for human beings to work and make a living over here, but these are deeply interconnected. And also there are other issues that are interrelated with that. So we have class, as soon as we start talking about economics. And, you know, before we began, Dr. Marandiuc and I were talking about what we would be doing today, and we were talking about our own teaching. And, you know, some of us have the privilege of doing this kind of work online and working remotely, while others of us do not have the privilege of working remotely, as we are doing even in this moment on Facebook Live. And class is a huge factor in that as we look at essential workers, whether we're talking about those who are working in grocery stores and pharmacies, and who are in any number of service occupations, cleaning the buildings of the schools, the universities and colleges, and K through 12 schools that we have in mind as we speak, cleaning hospitals, as Dr. Marandiuc mentioned in our pre-discussion. And then interconnected with that, you have race, you have gender, and you have sexual orientation. And it becomes ever more complex. And so the diagnosis is not just one thing, that either people work or everybody shelters in place, but how do we work, and how can we get everyone and in situations of equal opportunity in the workplace to be able to work remotely without filling out all kinds of health forms and you know, violating confidentiality, you know, that we should all have about our physical and mental health. So, you know, I always begin at home and, you know, and ask theologically, am I living according to what I profess, which is the greatest commandments in the New Testament are to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your strength and all your soul, and your neighbor as yourself. And so when I look at my own community, I'm living in Southeast Dallas, which is largely Black and Hispanic, also with some in this community are also of European descent. And I remember one day this spring, I was in one room working on something for a class, doing course preparation, and my husband was in another room looking at the news, and all of a sudden I hear this outcry from my husband and my adult kids, our neighborhood is on the news, our neighborhood is on the news. Because the Walgreens that we normally frequent on a regular basis was on the news, and they were talking about Pleasant Grove, and we live in Southeast Dallas, 1 or 2 blocks from Pleasant Grove, and so that's our Walgreens. You cross the railroad tracks near our house, and you're in Pleasant Grove, and hopefully we won't hear the trains this afternoon during this session. And so you have the essential workers right there, 5 minutes from our house. It's when you're in the grocery store, the essential workers are right there. I don't go. Some people in my family mask up and go. And then the further south you go, the more food deserts you have. And that's an issue because we have such a high population of homeless children and adults in Dallas. One of the highest in the nation. It goes back and forth between first and second in the nation. It's always so close. First, second, it really doesn't matter. It's just way too high. And then further south, you have Freddie Haynes's church, Reverend Dr. Freddie Haynes III. And you had a white supremacist trespassing to do some kind of protest about 2 weeks ago. And so people were doing a kind of drive through that neighborhood and at that church one recent Sunday to support that church. This same church has been distributing masks and food and coordinating with other churches, so that they're reaching hundreds, well, really a few thousand families, I think. So you have race, you have class, you have gender, you have sexual orientation. I'll just leave it there for now. But theologically, what does it mean to love our neighbor? And so am I masking up when I go out in public? Which is rare, but when I do, am I masking up? And do I make sure that other people who are not just in my immediate family also have masks? So my son's girlfriend and her family want to know where to get masks, and they're Hispanic, right? And Blacks and Hispanics are getting COVID, and not only getting COVID, but dying from COVID. That's something like 3 times the rate. Some statistics say more. Anybody can, join in and at whatever statistics you have. But loving your neighbor, I think, for me, is a primary theological, ethical matter.
Right, and loving one's neighbor includes, in my opinion, a way of thinking about the other's well-being, everybody's well-being.
Everybody's well-being.
That well-being refers to one's bodily integrity, one's health, and the economic well-being that surrounds the life conditions of such a person. And I think there are ways to work this out in a win-win sort of manner, rather than an either-or kind of manner. Because if the concern were to, for example, to preserve employment rather than preserve profitability, and that people would have options to work from home, a lot of people would have options to work from home, and also a lot of people would have options to people who don't actually have the option to work from home. If there were a lot of production of PPE equipment, it would be again a win-win, because people would be employed to produce those things, and people who would have to work outside the home on the front line would have the equipment. There are all kinds of creative ways to do that. It does not have to be an either or, and precisely the love of neighbor could be the logic that frames it.
Could I jump in on the
Yes, please do. I was looking forward to your comments.
Jump in on the either or. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So it's a good segue, because I was reflecting on this either or, because in the news you hear a lot, or especially a few months ago, a lot about either lives or livelihoods. Mm-hmm. And we are so polarized and so dichotomized in every way in our political climate, in our culture right now. And so you ask about bringing theological, moral, philosophical, pastoral framework. So when I look at this, I don't see two sides, but I see a common vision of a common good. And so I see people in different circumstances, this is the vision, working together to safeguard one another's health and flourishing. And that vision includes those on the front lines that you've talked about, the essential workers who risk their health in ICUs for the lives of others, the essential workers who deliver the food and drive the buses and collect trash and clean the buildings. But it also includes the shop owners, the restaurateurs, the barbers, the hairdressers, the gym owners, the nail salon workers whose ability to pay their rent and have food security does depend on their staying open. So I see both those groups together, and I see that there is a role for the government to play. And here, to me, the biblical principle is that a society is judged by the quality of care it offers to the most vulnerable in the society. And there are people who were already vulnerable, we know that, and they're dying at high rates, but people who are newly vulnerable. So to me, the government paycheck protection is a form of moral activity. There are a lot of arguments about that. The other thing too, then, from the point of view of the citizens, there's the principle of civic responsibility and, frankly, common sense. I've done a lot of work with wisdom. It's all about common sense. And common sense from those who have the luxury to be socially distant.
Right.
So that they can stay home and protect others rather than congregate. There's this sometimes I feel like there's this limitless, irresponsible, toxic individualism that we have in this country. So
that's true.
So there's the principle for me of I think the best in our society is to define freedom as freedom for others, but it seems like there's a confusion, a deep-seated corruption of that, so that it's freedom from any responsibility to anyone else. So and in terms of the wisdom literature of Scripture, the hallmark of a fool is saying, it's my life, what I do doesn't affect anyone else, bug off. So these principles of biblical care for the vulnerable, common sense wisdom in respecting others' health, working toward a common vision, and then I think understanding freedom as freedom for care for others, which seems to me to open it up into what the kingdom of God, the Basileia, the reign, the kingdom of God is all about. So.
Yes, so I'd like to add in, thank you, Dr. Maranduk, for the opportunity to be on this panel, the honor to share with my colleagues. My perspective is slightly getting to another aspect of these troubling issues that we're facing in our society. And it is looking at the root of some of the disparities that Dr. Mckenzie was speaking of, and my colleague, Dr. Baker-Fletcher, the polarity in our society, as well as the societal inequities. We know that these things exist. We know that they are a problem. We know that there are questions about, again, as Dr. Maranduk has been querying, questions of whether we have flourishing in our economy or whether individuals are seeking their own best health situations. But what are the roots to the polarities that make these questions relevant in our society? And part of my work illustrates the fact that these underlying divisions have to do with suppositions built into the framework of our country's ideology. And these suppositions are regarding human difference and beliefs about human difference, and particularly beliefs about human inequality, human caste, the fact that there are fundamental, not only differences, but fundamental innate differences that place human beings on a hierarchy of worth. And therefore, some persons have greater access to the material goods and economic flourishing in this society than others. And so the idea that certain people or certain groups are not worthy or beneficial of certain kind of access to the goods and flourishings in this society. And of course, these are ideas upon which our society, unfortunately, were built. At least in the beginning of the framing of this country, there were ideals of equality and equal access. But the reality on the ground is that there were deeply divided understandings of who had access to the quality of life, who had access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And these underlying presuppositions of human worth continue to plague our society.
Yes.
And our Christian imaginations, I believe, are called into play to challenge these innate suppositions that render some groups superior to others. And even among our Christian communities, there is a need to challenge these innate suppositions about human worth and human validity in our society.
Yes.
So this is part of what I think that this crisis that we're in, this COVID crisis, gives us the opportunity to rethink these underlying suppositions and to construct ways of attacking them and challenging them.
Absolutely. I'm really grateful that you talked particularly about the story of origin, so to speak, how these polarities have come to be, and how the right to life and happiness and all the other good things, the goods of life, while proclaimed to be for all people, they were actually for wealthy white men.
Right.
Yes.
And then the circle got larger and larger slowly through a lot of struggle, and it's still a narrow circle, and it's still a circle with lots of gradations. And perhaps we ought to ask not only how unjust that is, which of course it is, but also perhaps the very definition of what a good life is about ought not to be only in the terms of those who are at the center, the white wealthy men, but rather in the terms of everybody according to their own particular intersectional identity. So I'm really grateful for your comments. But
I really, if I could say, it just makes me think that in some reading I've been doing lately, keeps pointing out that first was the kidnapping and exploitation, and then came the hierarchy of value. So it's all right in there, baked in right there. And then comes the bogus scientific validation. So it's just so pernicious and demonic.
Right.
I have two related thoughts. One is, the Constitution, 3/5 of a man, 3/5 of a person, of course, is part of that underlying depth, root cause that we're seeing. But also during COVID, for women and children who are sheltering in place, domestic violence has risen. And I think this is directly related to who we think is human and who is more human and who is less human. And that's a very theological question, that it's connected to our concept of God and who we think God is and who God has created us to be. And, if you're only working with Genesis 2, where Eve is taken from Adam's rib, and you assume that, people do all kinds of things with biblical interpretation. But you have Genesis 1, in which God says, let us create them in our image. Elohim, right? Our image. Male and female, let us create them. But if you in your church are receiving and hearing sermons in which women is only helpmeet and, you know, lesser than
Right.
men, then your theological understanding enters into how you're going to treat women and children.
Right.
And could I add, picking up on what my colleagues, Dr. Baker-Fletcher and Dr. Marandiuc and Dr. Mckenzie, all of you mentioned, the idea of the economy being so central to our concerns.
Yes.
The fact is that it was through our economy and capitalistic enterprises that the notion of human inequality was established, as Dr. Mckenzie indicated. So any question about our economic flourishing is directly tied, whether we acknowledge it or not, to questions of human worth and who is a human being in this society. That because our history is so deeply entrenched with this struggle between those who are considered human, those who are not considered, or the gradations in between, it is impossible to address these questions without looking at the ways that our understanding of capitalism and the economy and the civil religion of our country is so deeply embedded in the understanding of even the average American. This idea of civil religion is intertwined in the theological understandings of many Christians in this country and their understandings of the way that society operates on this gradation or this hierarchy of human worth and validity. So the deconstruction that I believe that we're called to do happens at these very intense intersections, these intersectional conversations about worth and how they have been plugged into a historical understanding of what it means to be a citizen, what it means to have the rights and responsibilities of citizenry in this country and therefore access to goods and services. And so again, this is an implicitly theological question. How do Americans understand God? How do individuals or Christians understand the reign of God or the kingdom of God on earth? And how are goods and services distributed therewith?
Yeah, that's great. And in fact, now that we are talking about this, I'm going to pose another question, which I was going to get to later in our conversation, but I think it ties really well with what we've been talking about. So it's what I'm going to refer to is precisely this situation in which we live as a community, as a society in which people are not equal. There is an illusion of justice, but in fact there are lots of injustices and lots of inequities. And particularly, more recently, the Black Lives Matter movement has vividly shown that the racial injustice that permeates the American society and that has been part of our setup from the beginning is amplified by the pandemic exponentially. So on one hand, we have the pandemic of COVID-19. On the other hand, we have the white supremacy that is like a virus that inhabits the societal organism of this country in a parallel sort of pandemic. And there is a reinforcement that goes back and forth. So, so the disparities are striking. The pandemic makes them even more striking. And the Black and brown bodies are disproportionately sick and dying. Now, how do you think we can address this? Well, we are not in charge of really changing the whole society, but how do you think we could think about, how can we go about addressing such questions? What sort of imaginary we need to inhabit? What sort of theological story or narrative can we tell within which perhaps from within which we can think of solutions to address such injustices, because they are intersectional injustices, of course.
Well, one major biblical theme that comes to me is the body of Christ.
Mhm.
It's not like, it's the most intimate metaphor for a holistic organism or unity that, like we aren't saying the team of Christ, right? We're not saying the symphony of Christ. We're not saying the fruit bowl, right? It's a body in which, you know, if you cut your finger, it hurts like hell. Excuse me, we're on Facebook Live. It hurts like heck. It's a small cut, you know, just magnifies in any small. They say that minor surgery is surgery that someone else undergoes, right? So any part of violation or even just a nick or scratch in the body causes pain. And to me, that is truly to love one's neighbor as oneself. Perhaps even more profoundly, our neighbor is ourself.
Yes.
We cannot be separated from one another,
Right.
without harm to our spirit's life and our body.
Yes.
So to me, that is one narrative that, people just say, oh yeah, the body, we're the body of Christ, and you know.
Mhm.
But to really, and I would say that the COVID has not so much amplified, maybe it's amplified the injustices, but it's revealed them. I mean, it's revealed an ugly and cancerous pre-existing condition that leaves us vulnerable to what? Spiritual death, physical death. We all go down together.
Right.
So that sounds, and I know I'm jumping the gun because we're going to talk about hope later, but I've had to work on not staying in a very cynical place at times. You know, a very shadowy, cynical place. When I think about the implications of our behavior and the behavior of those around us, and the quality of our society. So somebody else say something hopeful now.
I'll jump in.
Okay.
During the recent funeral of Tamara Lewis, speaking of recent events, I was happy to hear an interview from James Lawson, United Methodist pastor, on the forefront of the civil rights movement and pioneered the nonviolent tactics that were used in the early student sit-ins and marches. And I was really happy to hear him in this particular interview embrace Black Lives Matter as a recent iteration of this historical struggle, as part of history, as one of the elders acknowledging the newer manifestation of the fight for equality and justice. And so in that sense, passing the torch. That was very hopeful because part of the long struggle is the struggle for equality in this country that began with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And part of our hope is the acknowledgement that individuals have always wrestled and challenged injustices by appealing to the ideal of equality that, like it or not, the signers of the Declaration of Independence, mostly deists, but inspired theologically by this vision of human flourishing as the body, as Dr. Mckenzie indicated, a community of human beings gathered together under God, living, working together for mutual flourishing. And so my hope is sustained by the fact that there have always been persons and individuals in our history always on the forefront. And this is a marathon, not a sprint. It is something that our nation is involved in for the long haul and beyond. And so, yes, this has definitely been a time, the past few months, of cynicism, with the news reports every day. There's always something, even as we're entering into the election season. As we know, the DNC convention is taking place virtually, and there have been alarming images associated with the present Democratic campaign. And so there are just always a number of things in our media feeds that can cause despair, honestly, in addition to cynicism, just outright despair about where we're going as a society, the perception that maybe even that we're going backwards, that we've lost and we're losing ground. We're reminded of those who fought, even with a lot less hope for the realization of some of the gains that we take for granted today. And yet they were in the struggle, and they did not give up. And these are the persons that I look to in those moments of encroaching cynicism and despair. People like James Lawson, people like Ella Baker, people like Fannie Lou Hamer. I mean, these are individuals that just give me so much pride, that give me so much hope, and remind me that as bad as things are now, or as they appear to be now, they've actually been worse in many iterations. So that gives me the kind of hope, staying connected to the ancestors.
Yes.
And as to keep me going.
Right. And as a preacher, as all of us are in some ways, but as someone who teaches others to preach and keeps in mind, what are we doing when we preach? We are not preaching the evening news, we're preaching the good news.
Yes.
And so
I like
there's
that.
a theologian, Mary Catherine Hilkert, she talks about how our job as preachers is to name ungrace, name the forces that work against this kingdom of God, this kingdom of justice and mercy, and then to name grace. And so we are to be detectives of the divine. And I love the rabbi's idea that we participate in tikkun olam, which is God's repair of the world.
Right.
So I think we're to be on the lookout for any ray of hope, any sprout of joy. And I think in terms of theological narratives, biblical narratives, I think about the parables of Jesus, in particular, his love for the seed parables, because the seed is the perfect metaphor for something that is vulnerable and unnoticed by the world, and perhaps subterranean for a time and season, but that cannot be impeded. The mustard seed that grows to be more impressive than the mighty cedars. So to me, that the seed, and Jesus himself then in John's Gospel is referred to as the seed that is buried and then grows. So Jesus is the ultimate vulnerable one that the world scorns, but yet Jesus' message, Jesus' presence, that hope that cannot be destroyed by any prejudice or hate, it lives on.
Right.
So that is, I don't want you to feel like I'm always a cynic, but there have been times in the past several months when I've gone to kind of a shadowy place. But I love what you say, Dr. Lewis and my other colleagues about hope.
Well, you're not alone in that, Dr. Mckenzie. I think so many of Americans, maybe most Americans, I don't know, but so many of us have had those cynical moments, and definitely moments of despair. And for me, it was the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, but George Floyd and the 9 minutes and however many seconds. I didn't even look at the whole video, but it was just the image of the knee. Well, I don't even need to repeat it, but that was traumatic. It was traumatic for many Americans, and it was particularly traumatic for Black Americans and for Black women. And to know that his last cries were for his mother.
Oh, no.
It was like, you know, I could feel my breast aching.
Mm-hmm.
And I am not a childbearing woman any longer. I am not of childbearing age, you know, but it took me back to when I was a nursing mother. And I know that so many African-American women, whether, you know, be it biological mothers, other mothers, or what, you know, there was this collective surge. And so you have this immediate protest in so many different cities in the United States and in so many cities around the world. And that was traumatic. And so there was this despair, but there was also this outcry of no more. And so the grief is very real. And I think cynicism and anger are related, and that is part of grief.
And perhaps part of hope too.
And where I find hope is in the uprisings, is, you know, and all kinds of people coming out and saying Black Lives Matters and demanding more PPE. And there are so many petitions you can sign for more you know, protective, personal protective equipment, right? That's where I find hope. And for me, this is Holy Communion. And here during this time of COVID, the sacrament of Holy Communion has been difficult. It's been challenging. Some churches have drive-in communion. Other churches say, you know, have your grape juice or whatever juice you want to use and some kind of bread ready, and we'll take it together virtually online. And that's one way of thinking of communion. But one of my favorite theologians is Dr. M. Sean Copeland. And I particularly enjoy teaching and sharing her book, Enfleshing Freedom, which is centered around bodies and crucified bodies. And so, you know, and COVID, when you have governors in different states with different rules, and you have a presidential administration that is late responding and all over the place, and people are dying unjustly, that is a form of crucifixion. And so for Sean Copeland, the significance of Holy Communion is that we are brought into communion with the entire Trinity, certainly, and particularly with Jesus Christ, who in Jesus Christ's wounds identifies and is a healing agent for our hearts, minds, and bodies and spirits, ministering to our wounds. And then we take that out into the community to share this good news with the world. And to me, this is the meaning of communion. And so we may not be able to go into our sanctuaries right now, but people are living out the essence of what Holy Communion is, as M. Sean Copeland describes it.
So they are themselves the consecrated elements.
They are, yes, we are the consecrated elements.
Right. Right. So I was wondering, we were going to talk, in fact, next precisely about the sacraments. So perfect intuition and transition. Just on a small related matter, as we were talking about grace a moment ago, Professor Mckenzie talked about grace so eloquently. So I would like to think together about a conceptualization of grace in terms of fortified resistance. So precisely because our society is so broken, and precisely because Black and brown lives suffer, and lives that are different suffer, right? If people who are queer, people who are differently able, people who have different ethnicities, people who are immigrants, all kinds of people who are different, they have it's like a larger baggage of suffering. You carry a bigger boulder. The society puts a bigger boulder on your shoulders, and these are structures, right, that we are inextricably part of in complicated ways. So I think as a theologian, one of the ways in which I found at least some inchoate hope has been to think of grace as a kind of augmentation of what we are as creatures, so that by participating in the presence of God among us, Christic presence, pneumatological presence, it's a way to fortify our ability to resist to what destroys us, to resist the boulders that crush us. And so that kind of imagination is just the beginning of thinking about grace in terms of resistance as a way to redirect our Christian imaginary, perhaps. But talking about grace and means of grace, you are all ordained clergy. What do you think about sacraments at this time? What ought, and not only what you think of them, but what sort of theological thought ought to guide our imagination for an answer regarding sacraments?
Right. Well, I was thinking about baptism, and I sense that, in my understanding, in my view, since as United Methodists, we privilege the grace, the initiative of God in the relationship, in the birthday of a Christian, and baptize children and toddlers, infants, right, before the age of decision. It seems to me we don't have an understanding that, as a more classic Roman Catholic understanding, that there is some preventative measure in baptizing a baby. You got to do it quickly so the baby doesn't go to limbo, which has eroded in recent years, of course. But so, since in my view urgency is not the issue, I was thinking, why not encourage parents to read together, read over the Baptismal Liturgy, because there's nothing that says that they cannot begin that they have to wait till the formal baptism to begin pointing their child onto this lifelong path of compassion and service to others.
Right.
So that would be my thought about baptism. With regard to the Lord's Supper, I think our colleague Mark Stamm has been very helpful in what he has written about it. And he talks in an article about when Jesus says, "Do this in remembrance of me," what is this? And he talks about it's a holistic kind of gathering, which includes the whole action from confession, reconciliation, offering the bread and wine, great thanksgiving, taking the cup, and going out, as you say, Dr. Baker-Fletcher, to be the elements for the world. Yeah. So there is the sense that this gathering is such a long-standing tradition of the church that if we, well, I mean, many churches have, if we begin online communion, then we'll continue it after it seems to me, right, perhaps be expected to. The thing that troubles me is the trivialization of the elements, for one thing. Like, everybody get your starch and your drink. You know, it can be a Dorito, it can be a Coke, it can be a donut, it can be coffee. I may be overstating that, but the trivialization of the rite. And I've been thinking, this is inchoate in my mind, but to me, the bread of life, the cup of salvation are profound metaphors for these basic life-giving elements of bread and wine, body and blood. A correspondence, a deep connection between the imagery of the church as the body of Christ and the bread, the blood of Christ and the red flowing wine, with those Hebrew precedents of the life is in the blood. To me, there's more than just a shallow analogy. So I'm just mulling all that over. So I guess I would say, I'm, as Dr. Stamm says, we're not the liturgical police. But for me, I'm with Dr. Baker-Fletcher on, I'm going to spiritually attempt to be the consecrated elements, and in some sense fast from from the actual partaking until such time as I can gather with others. While at the same time respecting that if that's significant. There are also some very helpful traditional ways. I remember we consecrate the elements, we take them to the homebound. There are churches, I think your church, Dr. Marandiuc, I believe, don't you? Priests consecrate the elements and then teams take them.
So they can be sent at home.
Yeah,
That's one option, or services outside.
Right.
The liturgy is outside, and so there are prepackaged items. So there are practical solutions.
Exactly.
But the idea is to think, what does the Christian community is about, and how do we think about how we are with each other and partake in the body and blood of Christ in the case of the Eucharist. And of course, the Eucharist is not the only sacrament. And with my closeted Catholic sensibilities, I guess, I want to think particularly about the last rites, the last that people want to take, and many want to take it because they are dying. This pandemic is a deadly monster, and so so with that, I want to ask one more question, if we want to pause just a bit more, or reflections on that note. So there are many indeed who are isolated, not just isolated at home, but are isolated, suffering in ICU departments in hospitals. So isolation is needed in a way to stop spreading the contagion, but it amplifies the mental health problems. It erodes our sanity. And there is a clergy dimension to this, right? What do we do in the case where it's dangerous for the pastor, the priest, the rabbi, the imam to go in the hospital, not only because the person risks their lives, but it spreads further. And yet we ought to give care to the sick and the dying. So how do we parse this out? And particularly given, as some do, place significance to a larger spectrum of sacraments, such as the last rites, such as Sean Copeland, that Professor Baker-Fletcher mentioned. She's Catholic, so she would pay attention to that. But how do you think of this?
Wow.
Well, as with the Lord's Supper, and I didn't mean to come on too strong about, being too negative about that, because there are ways to take that to folk, which could follow protocols, COVID protocols. So I'm wondering if the same kind of principle could be applied to the last rites. It seems to me at that moment that what comfort can be offered. I gave my mother the last rites, Protestant version, in February. She passed away right before the COVID, but I was able to be there in Pennsylvania at her bedside. And I would just think about, what if it had been a month later? How would I have been able to be present to her and say the things to her that I wanted to say?
I know that hospital chaplains are doing this a great deal right now, and very much on the front lines. I was actually ordained a deacon in the American Baptist Church, although, I'm a member of a Methodist church these days because I teach at a Methodist school. And I loved being a deacon because it was all about communion and taking communion to the sick and shut in.
Right.
I'm not doing that now. And depending on what risk group you're in as an elder or as a deacon, that would have a lot to do with whether or not you're doing any of that work in hospitals. I have some colleagues not only where I work, but outside of Perkins School of Theology, Southern Methodist University, who are ministering to the sick and offering Protestant versions of last rites during this time. And they don't always have, they're not always given personal protective equipment, because that tends to be reserved for doctors and nurses. And so they are frontline workers, but they're not being given the same protective wear. And so we need justice for our clergy who are doing this work.
Right.
Yeah.
Our
Well,
clergy, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. No, you go ahead. No,
Our
go ahead.
clergy are definitely on the front lines, and they're essential workers, just as our doctors and nurses. And yet we know that so many of our healthcare workers have experienced contagion, have contracted the disease, and this is part of the challenge. And I agree with Dr. Baker-Fletcher about the justice issues regarding protective wear and other ways of protecting our clergy in our hospitals. Participating in caring for the sick and dying as part of the work that I did as an ordained pastor in hospitals was one of the most intimate, most powerful spiritual experiences that I've ever encountered in my ministry and vocation. And hearing about individuals in ICUs passing away on their own, with no family present because of social distancing, maybe only a nurse or doctor, not even that necessarily in the room with them, has been the most heartbreaking news to hear as a Christian and as a pastor. And I believe one of the justice issues that I believe that we should be speaking to as clergy and as theologians, there is this challenge of dealing with the question of contagion. And even history tells us that during plagues and afflictions of various illnesses, individuals would die alone in their homes. And often there was the lone solitary priest or even women who would risk life and health to care for the needs of the sick. We saw that image in the great life story of Saint Teresa, those who were willing to get in the trenches with those who are suffering. And this unique situation in our moments, our country's history, our society's history, calls us to re-envision ways to ensure that communities, that human beings receive care, even in desperate times such as these and a highly contagious virus. We must be intentional and vigilant about thinking about ways that we can actively take care of the sick and dying as much as possible, as much as we possibly can.
Right. We talked earlier, some of you mentioned, I think Professor Mckenzie mentioned, maybe some others did, about, I think you, Professor Lewis, have mentioned about the economic disparities and the economic inequalities that are part of our plague. And so think for a moment with me, just let's imagine, right, that it would not be a matter of profit making to make the PPE equipment, but it would be a matter of those who need it most would get it. It's not a matter of who can afford it, but who needs it, right? So if the people who pick up the trash, if the people who clean the floors in the hospitals, the people who clean the floor of the Whole Foods, for example, where those who drive their Teslas to Whole Foods to load up on organic tomatoes. And yet there are people who have to clean that parking lot, but more importantly, people who clean the places, the refrigerators, and, actually the cold places are preserving the virus more. So I gave the example of Whole Foods for the sake of illustrating an economic disparity. and yet these economic disparities exist for multiple reasons, and they show the way in which economic resources are horribly unjustly present in the human community, in the human society. Now, of course, someone who is sweeping the floors won't have money to buy an N95 mask.
No.
Or even a hazmat suit. That's a cheaper one. I hear that N95 masks are a little bit cheaper now. So I think that's part of how the logic of capitalism functions, right? So those who have resources would have access to goods that are, in some senses, luxurious. In other senses, they are vital. But perhaps we can imagine it in a different way. Perhaps we can imagine that all human beings are to be treated with dignity because they have inherent dignity as creatures of God, as children of God.
Yes.
And if we think in those terms, then whoever is most exposed should have the most protective equipment.
Exactly.
Who cares about how much it costs?
Exactly.
This is the time in which we are in it together, right? So with that passionate appeal,
Yes.
what do you think, from your own perspective, what kind of paradigm shift do you think might be needed, or would a paradigm shift be needed in the first place? How would you comment on the possibility of altering perhaps the moral and theological, practical even, imagination that is operative in this society of a very, I would say, late stage finance dominated capitalism, in which people are much more crushed based on things that have to do with inequalities that are not related to their persons, their own lives, their own wills, but are simply there because of the system that is so unjust. Now, my question is, what do you think would take to perhaps shift the imagination? You talked earlier, Professor Lewis, about the civil religion. That I think has a lot to do with it, but there may be other angles. So I'll just stop here to hear your comments about how can we fertilize our collective imagination with a good with a good narrative, perhaps a narrative inspired by our Christian theological work, to create possibilities for more justice. We don't have to necessarily dismantle capitalism as such, but perhaps there are other ways to imagine how we could live.
And the thing is, the protective gear is just one symptom of profound and deep problem. Those people that can't afford protective gear also may be food insecure and have higher incidence of health issues. So it's one symptom among many. I mean, I think the vision of the kingdom of God, I like better than kingdom of God.
Me too.
And the idea that it is in my work on the parables, the understanding of the kingdom of God is that it's not under our control, that it shows up where we least expect it. It disrupts business as usual, and it is a kingdom of justice and mercy that will not be denied.
Right.
So then the question is, Dr. Marandiuc, then how do we participate in that kingdom? That sounds all great, doesn't it? But how do we participate in something that it's subversive? We've got to be subversive. Prophetic, like, is in your face. Subversive is digging under the foundations. And so how do we do that? I think with the death of George Floyd, the graphic, the emotion of it did some of that work. I mean, it got people outraged.
Yeah.
But this, how do we get people outraged about this vast inequity?
Right.
Yeah. My youngest daughter commented the other day, and she works part-time. And so she's out there with customers. My son works for GNC, which was considered an essential service. I don't know why general nutrition is. But I guess, but it was considered an essential service. So he's been working a long time, sheltered in place for a while, but anyway, my daughter commented, you know, she was feeling very tearful. And she said, Mom, when 9/11 happened, 3,000 people died. And we had memorial services and we had a national time for mourning. And this was last week. So she said 165,000 people at that point, a week ago, have died from COVID. And we have not had any kind of memorial service that draws us together. And so one of my visions, or what I envision, is that we need to have such services periodically throughout this, so that we can collectively grieve and also honor the fact that so many have died. And I think, yeah, I can't help but wonder if it would be easier for us to imagine, and for this kind of, you know, uprising that you said it just kind of emerged after the George Floyd incident. I wonder if that would help us, you know, be creative collectively as to how we can work together. Because the other thing that my daughter said about 9/11, and she was very young then, but she remembers it. Well, and then one of her family members was a firefighter who died. So we commemorate that every year. But people galvanized together, and that was for 3,000 people. So what could we do for 100 and how many is it now? And growing?
That's 172,000 plus.
172,000 plus.
As of now, yeah.
Because I think, yeah, I wonder, when there's silence around so much death at the national level, does it silence, you know, our nation's imagination?
Good.
And I'm just wondering.
And what is the role? What is the role of lament?
Yes.
What about lament?
Lament.
Yeah, lament. I mean, we lament. We don't lament that we don't lament because we think that there is no God or God is absent. We lament because we expected God to show up and we are waiting.
Right. And perhaps lament is a form of prayer. And perhaps prayer is a way in which we participate in God's work in the world. Perhaps our lament with the Spirit, as the Spirit itself, God's own Spirit laments within creation to bring creation up to and closer to its destiny to participate in the life of God, and for God to be fully all in all. So so one suggestion that comes to mind for me is to think both in terms of the Christian narrative of origin and the Christian narrative of destiny. So on one hand, we are children of God, creatures of God, having been brought into the world as a result of God's love, to be the recipients of God's love. God created us in order to love us, and God created us because God loves us. And so for the same reason, God takes us to the final destiny that, according to the Christian theological narrative, we have to participate in the triune life of God. And we are in the in-between. And the in-between is fraught and terribly broken. And it's within this brokenness that comes the disease, comes the pandemic. So so what I think might be in some, at least, in a small way hopeful, perhaps in in an incipient way hopeful, is to think about our in-betweenness between our origin and our destiny, and both
Yes.
are stories of our participation in the life of God and God's participation in our own life, kind of a double participatory way. And so from within this place, we can think of a different kind of contagion, a counter contagion, the contagion of goodness that comes through the channels of this intrinsic linkage that we have with God. God as our creator and God as our destiny. So we are, in that sense, in contagion with the goodness of God, the love of God, and through us, by being neighbor to one another, care for one another, and be of genuine and direct help to one another. So that's just,
yeah. And I love this idea that of contagion. And another thing that comes to my mind is that you ask, you know, how can we envision a response to the injustice of the people who need this protective gear can't get it?
Right.
So the maybe lament has a diagnostic kind of function. We name the lament.
We name it.
And I was thinking, Dr. Marandiuc, as you so eloquently were talking about creation and destiny, I was thinking about this image of breath, because George Floyd, I can't breathe.
I can't breathe, yes.
And then so that's the pandemic of racism. I can't breathe. And then people in the last stages of COVID, they can't breathe.
They can't breathe.
And then somehow thinking about God bending down in the dust and breathing into, and the human one became nefesh, right?
Yes.
So I just think there's maybe some fruitful, it seems to fit, Dr. Marandiuc, with what you've been saying about beginning and destiny.
right.
Yes. And then Dr. Lewis, you were talking earlier about the ancestors and this eternity that is in the past. So we have future eternity, and we have the eternity of the past and the wisdom that comes from the ancestors. It's so very important in African American tradition. And once we make lament a ritual, a formal ritual, you know, we get to honor those who have become ancestors and the wisdom that they bring to us. And then we build our vision in part, not only off of our own ideas regarding how to get this PPE to everybody who needs it, but also on the wisdom of these ancestors.
Right. Who are the community? We're surrounded by this cloud of witnesses.
Yeah. And so this in-betweenness of creation, and then we have the ancestors, and then we have this future that we're aspiring to and that we're concretely working on. Right.
And on a practical level, the wisdom and insights of the ancestors fill us, infuse us with inspiration in life, even as we are connected to divinity, which gives us the motivation to really envision and come up with practical solutions to thinking about something, as you suggest, Dr. Marandiuc, is really commonsensical, giving people on the front lines protective gear so that they can carry out their essential services. It's pretty logical to me, right? And yet this is a challenge for us. Like our ancestors, like those who are in the communion of saints, the church triumphant, to use Christian language, we have many instances in our history of the ingenuity of people working in equally challenging situations, hostile situations, and using their ingenuity to come together and pull resources, even if just in local communities to start, right? But pulling resources to provide for the needs of other people in their community, understanding that connectedness, understanding that our brother and our sister are connected to us, that we are all one, and that in caring for the other, we are caring for ourselves. That wisdom can be applied to thinking of practical ways of addressing these challenges.
Great.
Well said.
Very well said. So with that, I would like to, as we are drawing the conversation to a close, I would like to give each one of you, if you want to give a final word or image or thought more broadly on this cluster of topics.
Well, I'll start. This has been a very challenging time. It's been unprecedented for many in our lifetimes.
Yeah.
For someone such as myself, who spends a lot of time thinking about the past, thinking about the challenges of the past, of horrific situations in our past, what we have been living through has caused me to do a lot of reflection with the way that we handle tragedy, the way that we handle pain, collective pain. And I am inspired by the very familiar image of Jesus going out early in the morning before it was light to pray and talk to God. Many of us have been wrestling with what it means to social distance, particularly persons such as myself who live alone and do not have immediate family. And so the human touch that one takes for granted, the human presence that one takes for granted, for many has been obliterated in many ways. And people have had to think of imaginative ways of connecting to others. The very high-tech ways that we communicate, the uses of social media and technology are all there and have been helpful, but also that need to deeper commune with the divine, and to expand our spiritual practices, even in our own personal meditative spaces, ways that we reaffirm our own awareness that we are completely loved, unconditionally, totally, and unreservedly loved, loved by the divine, accepted, affirmed, nurtured, supported, and to remind ourselves of that unconditional, abundant love that flows continuously for us and to us and in us, for strength, for inspiration, for healing, and to realize that in times such as these, it's okay to step back, take some time, center oneself, reconnect, and recharge with the divine in order to go forward and living out to do what God has called us to do. But just as Jesus needed to recharge, so we too, the very much more, need that recharging, that regular rejuvenation that takes place through our spiritual encounters with God.
I think I would emphasize that I know in this time many people don't feel God present with them, and the witness of Scripture and our tradition is that just because we don't feel God present with us, we don't have that kind of power to you know, evict the creator of the universe because we don't feel God present. So to remember that, I think, is crucial. Also, as Martin Luther King Jr. says, the arc of history bends toward justice. I think I made this word up, but the word is unthwartable. And so to me, you know, my word that goes forth from my mouth will not return to me empty, but it will accomplish that for which I purpose it, which is the foundation for our preaching and teaching, that confidence. And drawing from my work on wisdom, which is a gift from God and is the beginning of trust in God. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. To me, with wisdom, God offers us a way of living and relating to each other, that radical love of neighbor, that cruelty and racism and hatred cannot kill. And so Jesus, influenced by woman wisdom's boldness and practicality, is a crucified and resurrected sage. And Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza refers to him as Miriam's child, Sophia's prophet.
Yes.
Ben Witherington calls him wisdom in person. So my final word for this time and the future is that Jesus, wisdom in person, is present with us to guide us, to correct us, to energize us, to comfort us, to surround us with love and hope, even in our most cynical moods.
Well, I am thinking that both Martin Luther King Jr. and the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement, like Alicia Garza, Patricia Kong Cullors, and I'm missing the name of the third one right now. But certainly the first two have spoken about and written about love. And King wrote about love, and it wasn't a sentimental love, the kind of love that Dr. Lewis is talking about, that you've talked about, Dr. Marandiuc, that Dr. Mckenzie have talked about, that I've been talking about. That it is a love that Martin Luther King Jr. talked about having the strength to love. And it is a love that is paired with power, and not just paired, but it is integrated with power and justice. And it is demanding. And sometimes we think that our voices don't matter, but everyone's voice matters.
Yeah.
And I just encourage everyone to continue raising your voices to demand justice, because that is loving.
I really appreciate and like this very much, the idea that justice is loving and justice and love are inseparable. And this would be what I would actually like to focus on in my just a couple of sentences to bring this to a close. The thought that I'm inspired by and have been inspired by for a long time, in fact, not just for this pandemic, but the pandemic accents it even further. It's the idea of the beloved community, also coming from Martin Luther King Jr. So the beloved community is a just society, is the Hebrew Bible's idea that peace and justice come together. That peace and justice kiss each other, as the metaphor goes in the Hebrew Bible, right? And the peace in the sense of plenary well-being, fulfillment in every sense of the word, in every dimension of lived life for all people of the community. So we are talking about a community that centers around the common good and yet upholds the individuality of each member. And so while we cannot stop the virus from existing in the world, we can't do that. What we can do is participate in just structures, life-enhancing structures that protect us more, a whole lot more. So I think that is within the realm of what we can do. And I think there are, as we talked in this conversation, and I hope the viewers will be inspired by this, there are rich resources in the stories of this tradition that we are representing here, Christian theological tradition, to think about ways in which we can amplify justice. Well, thank you very much. I look forward to more conversations.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Likewise.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, thank you so much.
Such a pleasure. Such wonderful remarks.